and I probably shouldn't say this, but especially considering it's being taped, but I'm going to say it anyway. And that is, there's very little from Chapter 7 on the test. Most of what's on the test is from Chapter 6. All right, because that deals exclusively with the DOM. Now, please don't, look at the test and say, well, he lied to us. No, I didn't. I said most of it. I didn't say necessarily every bit of it. And reading this chapter, and this is one of the shorter chapters in the book, we will be done with this by 9 o'clock. All right, and maybe earlier. But reading these chapters does nothing but help you for when you take the test. All right, so again, I would suggest that when you are taking your test on Monday, you can start it with a pretest, but I would suggest you have that pretest, that not only the pretest open, but the thing I sent you with the example problem in it, W3 schools, anything else that you think might help you. There's also, if you're interested, dev.mozilla.forums has got a big thing, or developer, I should have said, not dev. They've got a big thing on forums as well. All right, and that's under developer.mozilla.org, under the documents, learn forums. And I'm not saying this is going to give you everything in the world you need. Don't get me wrong. There's no magic bullet in here. There's nothing that I can give you that, hey, basically, Jeff, we'd like something where it's basically just plug and play. So in other words, you give us something, we go in, we put it all in. There's nothing like that I know of. Unless you're going to use a package like, maybe you've seen the commercials for things like GoDaddy or Wix or some of those places. All right? I mean, you can use those kind of packages, but the idea is what you're hopefully at least learning in here is you are learning to do this stuff yourselves. And I've used this example before. Maybe it's not a good one, but I'm going to use it again anyway. That, if I was ever going in to have an operation for whatever reason. So I'm going in to have an operation. Guys, just so you know, and women also, I guess, but guys, after you turn 50, it's like every 5 years you're supposed to get a colonoscopy. All right? They put you to sleep and they play around in your butt. All right? I mean, not just being crude, but that's the way that it is. But the point is, what I don't want is I don't, want to sit there and have the doctor come in and say, oh, you're not the guy who did it last time. He goes, yeah, I don't even have a degree yet, but I'm learning. Or I don't want somebody to say, well, I watched YouTube. I think I'm ready for this. I mean, and hospitals don't do stuff like that. But in the same way, the idea is you are able to go into a company, and even if the company did use a package like Wix or something where they kind of pre-package, you can go in there and hopefully fix it. One of the things that I will show you during the last full week of classes is a package that you may or may not be interested in. I probably even said the name to you already, but it's called Mobirise, and it's drag and drop. You literally could set up your whole portfolio with Mobirise, but it's not, you don't learn much doing it that way. It's just because it's all drag and drop. All right, not only that, when you use Mobirise, unless you pay like 60 or 70 bucks, you can't change the CSS that they give you. All right, enough. So let's start on chapter 7, how to work with links, images, and timers. So one thing to notice in here, we have 3 different things we're talking about. All right. Now the first thing they're going to talk about is links. Would you all agree that the way that a link is set up, you've got a link, you click on it, and you go somewhere. Would you agree with that? That's by default, that's what a link does. But you can cancel the default action of an event like a link. Why might you want to do that? Well, again, going back to what we just looked at here, get rid of that, and get rid of that. Try to bring that up. If I come down here and I click this, I want it set up that it doesn't actually submit and go someplace unless everything has been validated. Does that make sense? And I don't want there to be any chance that it does do that. So what I can do is I can check, and if there's any fields that are invalid in here, I can prevent this from doing its default action. Does that make sense? Okay. You can do it with anything. You have to know what the default action is, but you can cancel that default action if indeed that is what you want to do. So we'll talk about that. All right, the next thing, they'll talk about how to preload images. What they mean is, when you preload, two things happen. First of all, it tries to load your images in as fast as possible. That's always a good thing. And second of all, it does what's called caching your image. C-A-C-H-I-N-G, which means it's going to kind of put them in a special area in memory. All right. So if you get out of the site and get back in again, it'll try to grab them from that area in memory. Now, if they've changed, they won't do that. But they'll load faster that way. So they'll talk about that in here. Then they'll talk about an image swap. You've already seen some of this. So if I've got, like, let's say 5 thumbnail images at the top of my screen, and I click on any thumbnail, and then down below I get a big picture of that. All right? Now, is this something that you could use? Think about it. I'm asking you this. Wouldn't it be possible, if you wanted to do it this way, couldn't you have images, maybe an HTML image, a CSS image, a JavaScript image, a Bootstrap image, a DOM image, etc.? And if you clicked on each one of those, maybe it could bring up down below it a program that did those. Something like that, just as an example, okay? Usually when it's used is very similar to what they'll show in the chapter here. So that's the other one. Then we talk about how to use timers. And notice the difference in there, a one-time timer and an interval timer. Now, I'm dating myself here. Even those of you who are young, have you ever seen something that looks like this? All right. Back in the olden days, you didn't have 2 buttons on here. You had 1. You wound the darn thing up. Hopefully you remembered to wind it up. You set the alarm, and there was no snooze button on it. Does that make sense? You hit it. If you went back to sleep, you went back to sleep. Otherwise, you got up. All right? Why am I telling you that? That is a one-time timer. You set it and forget it type of thing. It goes off, it does its thing, it's done. Now, if you look at the one here that's got, maybe that is a snooze or whatever, or you look at, you think about today's clock radios or today's alarm clocks, you can usually press the button on there and you get 9 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever it is. That's an interval timer. Do you understand the difference between the two? That's not the greatest of explanations, but it pretty much dovetails with the way it is. So suppose that you wanted someone, you work for a company, and at midnight, during this night, you guys are, this company that you work for, you're doing a massive update on your software. And you've got people who work there all the time. They're on 24/7. But at 11:30, you might give a message up that says, in 30 minutes, the system will go down for maintenance. Then in 10 more minutes, they get another message that says, in 20 minutes, then 10 minutes, then maybe 5, then maybe 1. Those are interval timers. All right? If they only got one message, we're going down in 30 seconds, that would be a one-time timer. All right? All right, and then they end up by going over a slideshow. Again, the chapter itself is like 15 or so pages long. It's not a long chapter. All right. Okay, so how to work with links and images. Again, they talk about this, canceling a default action. So here are common default actions. This is not an exhaustive list. The one you'll probably end up using, I should say the 2 you will probably end up using most of the time are the first one and the last one. The A tag, because you want to cancel going from where you are to another page or to another website. and the button. You know, especially like I said, if it's a submit. Typically, if somebody does a reset, you typically do a reset. You could, and you know how to do this, even though if you don't think you do, you could actually program a reset button. You wouldn't make it type reset, you'd make it type button. And if you had a big form with 30 fields on it, don't think that doesn't happen. But if you have a big field with 30 fields on it, let's say you screwed up one field, but the other 29 are okay. If you press reset, they're all gone, right? You have to key it all in again. But if it was your own button, you could bring up an alert or a confirm dialog and say, hey, I'm about to remove everything in every one of these fields. Are you sure you want to do that? And, all kidding aside, you wouldn't set it up so if they click yes, you wouldn't go, hey, are you really, really sure? No, you'd ask them once, because that's typically how software works. Either you're not asked at all, or you're asked one time. All right? So, one thing to realize about this, if you look at the first two examples here, the second example that says older IE code, that's like IE, I believe, 7 and 8 and below. Because if you don't know this already, one of the slams against Microsoft has always been that they've had this attitude that they should do things and that everybody else should follow. All right? And for a while, that pretty much was the way it was. Back in the 90s when we had these browser wars, there were literally just two browser manufacturers. There was Microsoft and there was Mozilla. All right? Went by a different name then, but it doesn't matter. But a lot of times what happened is Microsoft was so far out ahead of the curve that they did things, and then the W3 looked at it, and a lot of times they basically just said, yeah, what they did's pretty good. That's not how it works anymore. There's a lot of browsers. Say what you want to say about IE or Edge or anything else. Because of the fact that they come free in a Windows machine, they're always going to be around. All right, unless Microsoft gets broken up or whatever, which probably isn't going to happen anyway. All right, the point is, this is how old Microsoft handled it. This is how it's handled today. It's doing the same thing, but the key takeaway that I want you to get is today when you do this, if you want something to happen and you want to be able to work with an event, then you don't have to call it EVT. You could call it E. Some places call it event, but E or EVT are the ones that are used the most often. So this is saying prevent the default action from happening. If you associated that with a button, if you clicked the button, nothing would happen. If you associated it with a hyperlink, if you clicked the hyperlink, nothing would happen. And remember, one thing that you can do with Bootstrap is you can take a hyperlink and format it as a button. You might want to keep that in mind for next Monday. Okay? Now, if somebody says to you, hey, we got to be totally compatible, then you can do it like this. You can make the IE check first, and if it's not IE, fine. Then you can cancel. Otherwise, you can do it for IE. You sometimes see this code in there. More and more, that stuff's going away. All right? One of the things that Jquery did when they went to version 2, and I think it's even more in version 3, all right, Jquery said, we're not supporting IE8 and below anymore. We're just not going to support them. Now, how do you handle that? Well, you might, you can always go in and check if you're working for a company. You can check the browser version someone's using, and then tell them that this isn't going to work. That they're going to have to load a newer version. The problem is you get a lot of people, especially old people like me, that are set in their ways and don't like to do those kind of things. Well, this has worked forever. I don't want to put another thing in there. Probably told you this already, but I'll always remember. It was several years ago. It was around the time of IE6. So it was many years ago. And I went to visit my brother because I'd never seen his house. He lives up in northern Wisconsin. I happened to be at a conference that was an hour away. So I went in and stopped in and saw him. He had IE2 on his machine. And I said, why? So well, that's what came with a computer. First of all, I knew his computer was too old, but that was, it doesn't matter. And I said, you really should upgrade. Well, why? This works just fine. Okay. I explained why, and he didn't agree. That's fine. All right. So as it says, modern browsers today send an event object to the event handler. Remember, JavaScript, like most other programming languages, is an event-driven programming language. It is sitting there waiting for things to happen. It is waiting for you to click a button. It is waiting for you to enter something into a text box. It is waiting for you to choose something in a drop-down list or click a hyperlink or whatever. So as it says, most modern browsers send an event object, that's at E or EVT, to the event handler that's handling the event. They also provide, and notice, DOM compliant, prevent default. It says when you call this, it prevents the default action from happening. You can go up here and find the default action for many common events. You can go out to something like W3 Schools and get a listing of the default action for basically everything that you could check for. All right. Again, they talk about the older version of IE, and it says if you want to ensure true cross-browser compatibility, you need to provide both ways, and they just showed you how to do that. All right. Next, they go into here preloading images. As I mentioned to you, notice what they're doing here. First of all, this should make sense to you. Right here, var image equals new image. That's not an array. That's an object. So it would be like I would come in here and say var Gabriel equal new person. And then I could give him all sorts of things. Gabriel.eyeColor equals, I don't know what it is, blue. You know, Gabriel.hairColor equal brown, etc. All right, does that make sense? But here we're creating an image object. Here, as it says, this is how you can load an image into that object. This is using that HTML DOM compliant stuff that we talked about middle of the class on yesterday. There's another way you can do it, but it involves 2 or 3 lines of code as opposed to just 1 line of code. All right. Now, that's all fine for a single image, but what if you've got a lot of images and you want to download them ahead of time? Probably told you this before, but I remember going out to this site. I met somebody one night. I don't drink, but I before all this happened, I karaoke. And a friend of mine used to run a karaoke thing, and I would go out there. One night he was off, and he said, hey, come with me. I'm going to this other place. All right, we went there, and the long story short, what they did was they took pictures all night. And where, they had thumbnails, but they had literally about 100 thumbnails on their homepage. And you could click on any one of those thumbnails, and it would show basically on the whole screen what it was. Does that make sense? So what they could do with something like this is they could go in and they could download all 100 of those images at first if they wanted to do that. Why do you do that? For speed. I mean, because if it would take most people, that work with computers that are not computer people are unbelievably impatient. That was always the old joke where I used to work. They would always say, people who work with computers are the most impatient people in the world. And I would change it. No, people who are learning how to work with computers are the most impatient people in the world. I can't tell you how many times I've seen people murder their enter key thinking the harder they hit it, the more something's going to happen. All right, and I'd be lying if I said I never did it. All right, so what are we doing here? We want to preload all images referenced by the href attribute. So here, what are we doing? We're grabbing all the tags. Here we're linking through. Here we're saying basically set each individual image up, all right, and preload them. Make them available to us. That's what we're saying. And this is, to my knowledge, this is not on your test. This is about as hard as it gets in here for what we've done so far. All right, so it says when an application preloads images, it loads all of them that it's going to need when the page loads. And again, it stores the images in the browser's cache. So they're available if you come back to the page or whatever. You may or may not know this, but if I go out to CNN.com right now, I'm not going to, but if I do, I'll get their home page, correct? Now, if I say, I read through it and I get done, fine. If I come back 15 minutes later, if the page hasn't changed, typically it's cached. So somewhere in memory, it's got the previous page, and it gives me that one. The reason it does that, I can get it much faster that way. All right, but if it's changed, it'll usually change, check that. And there's all sorts of stuff you can do with caching. All right, if you're interested in how caching works, go have a talk with Mr. Corrigan sometime. He knows a hell of, he's forgotten more about it than I've ever known. All right. Okay, when the images are preloaded, the browser can display them whenever they're needed without any delay. We already talked about that. That's what your ideal is. To preload an image, start by using the new keyword to create an empty image object. Then set the source attribute to the URL for the image you want to preload. Again, all we're trying to do is speed up the process. So with this image swap application here, see that? Very similar to what I showed you before. Now, I don't remember if this is the one or not, and they may have even fixed it. I don't know. But it used to be, when you clicked on these, they were all 4 different sizes. To me, that looks really amateurish. When it's this big, and then the next one's this big, and then the next one's this, I don't like that. That's one thing, whether you were working on a site like the site for Ms. Kincaid for the Arrow Bridge Rescue, or even if you put something like that into your own portfolio, you should really shoot for having stuff being the same size. The other thing about that too, and this should just make sense, is when you do that, you want to scale the images accordingly. And what I mean is, let's say that this one right here that they're showing was bigger than all the other ones. And if you make these bigger, you can do that, but then they look grainy. You don't want to do that. You may or may not know this. You may or may not care. But when I sent you all the picture of the business card for Arrow Bridge, I had my daughter's mother-in-law, who's a professional photographer, take that picture. She's got a really good Nikon camera. If you take it with your phone and you make it bigger, it gets to a point it starts looking grainy. That's not professional. All right? Okay. So what do we have in here that's new? Well, look. We've got this image list. And in there, you can see what we've got. All right? We've got this caption, catch and release. Where's that? All right? Going to appear someplace in here. I don't know. And very little CSS. Again, what does display inline do? I'm asking you. What does display inline do on this picture? You should know this. Somebody, take a guess. Yes. The pictures are one after the other. If we did a display block, we'd have this one in one row, then this one would go below it, then this one would go below that, then this one would go below that. Does that make sense? All right. Now, that's something that if you were doing this with Bootstrap, you'd probably want to go in, and we talked about the grid system in Bootstrap, but you'd probably want to check it that when you get to a certain size, that rather than having that, you'd have 2 in a row, or maybe even just 1 in a row type of thing. All right. So the next figure that's in there, as it says, presents the JavaScript for the application. Notice, in the onload event handler, the first 3 statements get the object. All right. And these objects, as it says, are for the nodes in the DOM. Then the 4th one creates the array. Well, the reason for telling you that is this is pretty similar to what they had shown you earlier. But what they're trying to do, it's much easier to explain it by pictures than it is to go through the code. Because you want to make sure you've got 5 pictures up there. When you click on any one of those 5 images, whatever is down below it should be replaced by the one you just clicked on. I don't know any way to say it that's plainer than that. All right? And again, the key stuff is shown in yellow here. Again, EVT, it's the event. This, as it says, that's the one you just clicked. All right? It says cancel the default action. Well, it may be set up that by default when you click on it that it goes someplace. You don't want that to happen. So again, they are canceling the default action here. And why do you cancel a default action? To keep something from happening. Does that make sense? All right. So the last part of the chapter here, they're talking about how to use timers. Now, I will tell you, that come next fall, and hopefully every one of you in this room will be in the AWD1011 class, which is a class JavaScript on the server. When you start to learn about things that are called like async, await, and promises, and callbacks, etc., sometimes to demonstrate things, you use timers. All right? Because, and I'm just going to show you this. If I went and wrote something like this, all right, and I put 5 of these in here. Okay, I think you'd all agree that if that was my JavaScript program and I started it, it would show an alert box and it would say number 1. As soon as I clicked OK, it would show another alert box that said number 2. And it would do that 5 times. I think everybody gets that. But what we can do is, let's say that when we got to here, and I'm going to show you the code for it in a minute, but we put a timer in here. We told it, for example, right here, wait 2 seconds before running this alert. All right? The reason that, when you use timers, the reason this becomes important is now what's going to happen, because JavaScript tries doing things synchronously, one after the other. Now we just told it to be asynchronous. We've told it to give me an alert with number 1, give me an alert with number 2, give me an alert with number 4, give me an alert with number 5, then after 2 seconds has transpired, give me an alert with number 3. Does that make sense? So sometimes the easiest way to show that as you're starting to learn about this stuff is via the use of timers. Timers work with milliseconds too, just so you know, where 1,000 milliseconds is 1 second. Because sometimes people freak out, wow, you put 10,000 in there. Yeah, that's 10 seconds. All right. I already mentioned to you that yesterday when we went in and we looked at the DOM version of that game that we did, the guessing game, we could have set it up so that it would show your message up there, whatever the message was, for like 3 seconds or 5 seconds or whatever. All right, and then we could have had it disappear. You can do that with timers. All right. So as it says, a timer lets you execute a function after a specified period of time has elapsed. I just explained an example of one of those. They're provided by web browsers rather than the DOM and ECMA standards. So the browser itself is providing that for you. Timers are often used in DOM scripting applications like slideshows. Now, there are other ways of doing it. But if you want to create a slideshow using just JavaScript, all right, but just HTML and CSS and JavaScript, because there's other ways of doing it with Bootstrap and with Jquery, etc. But if you were just using those 3, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, you'd have to have some way of letting the user know that you could provide like arrows where they could go from function to one to another, etc. But what if they didn't know that? All right, you could set it up with a timer that every 5 seconds you transition from one slide to the other, and many programs are like that. All right, so as it says, the first type of timer is a one-time timer. Notice it says to create this, you use the global set timeout function. The first parameter is what you want it to call. The second parameter is how long do you want to wait before you call that. All right. So as it says, when you use this to create a timer, it returns a reference to the timer that's created. Then if necessary, you can use the reference to cancel the timer. It's kind of like, and I'm not that this makes me proud, but usually I've got my alarm set every morning for 5:30, and almost always I wake up at 5:25. And that's good because my wife's next to me and I like to turn off the alarm so she doesn't hear it. And the bad thing is if I'm sleeping that much, usually she has to shake the heck out of me to get me up. All right, but you get the idea. So it says the example in this figure is another version of that FAQ, Frequently Asked Questions app, that we used in the last chapter. This one, as it says, uses a one-time timer to start the download and installation of an upgrade after a delay of 5 seconds. You can cancel it if you want to. So let's take a look at what's in here. notice not only can you set a timer, you can clear it. Again, that's like turning your alarm off. All right? So notice what it says here. Upgrade will start in 5 seconds. I don't know about you, but I'm constantly getting things. You know, with Windows, it used to be that was the old joke that Tuesday was Windows Updates Day. You know, and a lot of times, unless you told it, you know, you set it up, your machine would just basically start running updates. Well, I mean, if I'm working on something, typically when that happens, it like turns the machine off and reboots it. I don't want that to happen. So this might be a place where I'd want to use that. So they show you this, and again, you could all write this. This isn't hard. They even show you the HTML. All right. Notice field set right here. There's your field set. They give that an ID of upgrade. The button, they give the button an ID of cancel. Notice it's type button. And the span that goes with it has got some kind of a message in it. Well, then they've got a hidden class. Remember, when you say display none, it literally is not there. Any space it takes is taken up type of an idea. It's just gone, for lack of better words. So here they're showing an example of a one-time timer. So this is it right here. This says when the program starts, you want to wait 5 seconds, and then you want to call start upgrade. Does that make sense to everyone? That's exactly how these things work. And the more you get into server-side JavaScript, which again you will have in fall of next year, in the fall semester, you're going to be working with this stuff all the time. And the reason for that is after a while, what we get into in that class is we get into working with databases. You people will do a little bit of work next semester with databases, and I'll show you some stuff. But in fall, you do a lot more work with databases. And databases can be problematic. What do I mean by that? The databases, quite often, they can take time. If I've got a database with 3 or 4 records in it, I get my answer like that. Come on. But if I get a database with 3 or 4 billion records in it, and I'm asking for 2 or 3 that match some criteria, it may not happen right away. So it's not timers that we use, but we use something that's like timers. All right. Again, callbacks or promises, etc. And there's other ways of doing it as well. Okay. So as it says there, the set timeout that you can see right here creates a timer that calls this function after this amount of time has taken place. The clear timeout cancels it. So what's the clear? There it is. All right. The interval timer is what I mentioned to you before. That's the second type. It'll run repeatedly. And I gave you that example how, you might say, for example, we're going to have an update in 30 minutes. There's your 30-minute warning. Okay? I mean, in pro football, they have a 2-minute warning, but they don't have anything other than that. They don't have a 1-minute warning, etc. But they could. So it shows you here 2 methods for working with a timer that calls a function repeatedly. Set interval and clear interval, just like you had set timeout and clear timeout. All right? So notice what they're using here, the number of seconds that you've been on the page. Now it's kind of a convoluted example because typically people don't care. All right. One thing that is kind of nice that, like, for example, that Google does, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, that a lot of times, like if I do a Google search and I notice that something is already in purple, meaning I've already gone there, then down below it, it'll say, you last visited this page on. That's kind of nice. Because I'm looking at it like, well, if it was yesterday, it probably hasn't changed much. But if it was a year ago, it might have changed a lot. All right. So here's the code for that. And again, you've got to look through it. All right. So what are they showing us here? As you run through this and you go and you click on each one of these, this is going to work exactly the same. Plus, when you click on the plus, it'll show you the hidden div, and then there'll be a minus here. When you click on the minus, it'll go and disappear again. All right, but this, like I said, it's just a running counter that shows you how long you're on the page. And this right here is telling it to update that amount every second. Does that make sense? Now, it's not going to be perfect, because there often is a little bit of lag time because the system is sending messages out. All right. If I said, see how fast you can snap your fingers. You went like that. Okay, that's fine. Can other people do it faster than you? Yeah. Can other people do it slower than you? Yeah. All right. So there's a little bit of lag time depending on a lot of different factors, or there can be, is what I'm saying. So again, the set interval method creates a timer that calls a function each time the specified interval in milliseconds has elapsed. Like we said, like this one, right there. All right. This method returns a reference to the new timer. It's not that big a thing. Although you cannot modify an interval timer, you can cancel it and create a new one. What does that mean? That means that if you decided you wanted a message to come up every 10 minutes and you wanted to change it to 5 minutes, if it's already been set in the code, typically you'll remove the one that you had and then set up a new one. Okay? All right, and the program or the chapter ends talking about, as it says here, this slideshow application. And as I mentioned to you, this is kind of a crude way of doing it. It used to be this was the way most everybody did it. Some people, I've heard this before because they've gone through this example and they're like, well, it's a lot more jerky like than it is when you use Bootstrap or when you use something else. Yeah, because there's other ways of doing it. And not only that, there's other ways of doing it that typically involve a lot less code. All right? So they show you the JavaScript here. I'm not going to run through any of it. I told you I'd get you done by 5.2. We pretty much have. All right? The only other thing that I wanted to say to you, if you look here, come on, there we go. Starting next week then, we're jumping into the land of Jquery. All right? Jquery basically allows you, it's a JavaScript library that allows you to use JavaScript with CSS. There's more to it than that, but it's really kind of what it allows you to do. All right? So we're going to be writing a lot of the same kind of code. This is going to sound silly, but it's a lot of the same kind of code, but different. So we'll be writing the same kind of code, but we'll be writing it in a different way. I would strongly suggest that, because we'll have the test Monday. Tuesday we're going over 8. Wednesday we're going over 9. I would strongly suggest before Tuesday you try to read chapter 8. Before Wednesday you try to read chapter 9. Some of these chapters, I'm not even sure how long they are. Fast Start, that's not a short chapter. It's about 30 pages. All right? And, so at least page through it. All right? We will be doing things next week like we will be going out to jquery.com. I've already shown you this site. We will talk about different ways that you can download jQuery. We will also go in and we will look at what's called the API documentation. What is that? This right here, if I click on this, these are all the things that you can call with jQuery. I've never counted them. I don't have the patience to do that. We will not go over every one of those. Be real. Maybe 10%. I don't know. I have no idea. So again, we'll look at the API documentation. We'll also go in, and I've shown you this before, but I'm showing it again anyway, to jQueryui.com. And again, I've shown you examples like this. So if we went in, what we just did, the accordion. There's an accordion example. All right? Very similar to what we just did, right? And then down below, they always give you the code. You click View Source. There's the code. The good news is, look, that's all the JavaScript there is. That's it. So that's going to really allow us, in many cases, to write a lot less JavaScript code. But we'll have to be very specific in the way that we write our CSS if we want it to do what we want it to do. So we'll go over 8 and 9 to get started, and then we'll go over at least 10 and 11 the following week, and that's Thanksgiving week. All right. When you come back from Thanksgiving, my plan is to go over the rest of the book, probably two chapters a period. But we're not going to have any tests on them, not going to have anything on them. So why are you going through them, Jeff? Because a lot of that material is stuff that you're going to use in full. So you will at least have seen it. You might totally forget it, but you will have at least seen it. All right? Unless there's any questions, that's what I had. All right? So you will have some kind of a pretest when you come in here tomorrow. You work on that as long as you want to. If you don't want to work on it at all, that's your call. But you know what work is going to be due Friday.